This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
The adaptive leadership is broken into two areas. It's a diagnosis phase and an action phase.
This episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, the official coffee of the Deep Leadership Podcast. Salty Sailor is a veteran-owned coffee brand on a mission to deliver premium, fresh roasted coffee while making a positive impact in the world. Their motto is drink coffee and do good, which reflects their commitment to making amazing coffee and actively supporting the military community. 10% of every order goes to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, an organization dedicated to helping sailors, Marines, and their families in times of need. All our listeners get 10% off every order of their amazing coffee by using the discount code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at saltysailorcoffee.com. Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Erik Kellener. Erik is a partner at Evolution, a coaching, consulting, and investment firm. He is a leadership coach, management consultant, and strategic advisor. He brings more than 20 years of operating experience as a technology executive and thought leader for both emerging and established brands in the U.S. and overseas. Erik's passion is directed towards unlocking leaders and their teams through a recipe of self-development and the integration of leadership strategies and frameworks. He is a believer that those leaders who adapt and recognize when change is necessary will foster a culture of innovation and resilience. And I'm excited to have him on the show to talk about the concept of adaptive leadership. So, Erik, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, John. It's great to be here. Honored to be invited here.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. And I'm excited to talk about this idea of adaptive leadership and leaders needing to adapt to changes. So let's just get started off. I mean, how would you define adaptive leadership? What is adaptive leadership?
Okay. So essentially, adaptive leadership, it's a practice that was introduced in I think it was the late 90s by a couple of Harvard professors, Martin Linsky and Ron Heifetz, on their search to really look at organizational development. And in a nutshell, it's a practice that's highly tuned towards solving a specific type of problem, which is known as an adaptive challenge. An adaptive challenge doesn't necessarily have a generalized solution with a well-known expert. It requires learning along the way by seeking a variety of different inputs and perspectives. And it's an iterative type of model with a unique path to a solution. And it just takes time to address. So it's not geared for problems where a solution is already well understood. So those are called in the model of adaptive leadership, those are called technical problems. Not necessarily in the high-tech sense, but they're called technical problems because they have a clear solution or an expert that knows how to do it. So as an example, if you have a leak in your house, you call a plumber. They're really good at doing that. They're the expert and they know how to fix leaks. But it can also be a complex issue. Something like a heart bypass surgery, which, those are some really complex issues that require a lot of skilled people, but it does have a known solution on how to do it. And that's kind of the highest level, but the adaptive leadership is broken into two areas. It's a diagnosis phase and an action phase. A diagnosis phase is where you are within the system. You are focused not only on trying to understand what's going on here, but also understanding the people, including yourself as the leader. Like, what are your reactive behaviors? How do you show up? What is your attitudes? But also understanding the different data elements of what an adaptive problem is, and specifically drawing some kind of interpretation as to why these things are happening. And it often requires your ability to zoom in or zoom out. So that's one of the capacities of leaders that I think do really well, is they have to be able to dive deep, but also be able to elevate themselves at a broader level. And in the adaptive leadership model, the term is coined getting on the balcony. And that is, it's a really good metaphor where if you kind of look at a dance floor, there's lots of conversations going on, trying to deal and really understand different challenges. But when you need a different perspective, you kind of raise yourself above to hop on the balcony because you get a different vantage point of some of the challenges that need to happen. And that's part of the a diagnosis phase. And then there's the action phase. That's kind of what are the interventions that are needed to help move the progress of the adaptive challenge. And it's experimental in nature and it requires a lot of iteration. So that, in a nutshell, that's what adaptive leadership is.
So you mentioned that it's really for an adaptive challenge that an organization is facing. So it wouldn't be like a known challenge, like you said, it might be a difficult challenge, but there's known solutions. This is a defined way of doing. You're saying these are challenges that maybe the organization hasn't seen before, that we don't know the impact. So maybe give us an example of what an adaptive challenge might look like for a company. I think COVID is maybe the big example, but there's probably others.
Yeah, it's so let me give you, give you almost like a couple of examples on like two polar opposites. Company mergers are a
Mm,
great example, acquisitions.
yeah.
And not to say that companies haven't gone through mergers or acquisitions before, but they're in adaptive leadership, you can have these problems that may appear to be technical problems that have a solution, but they could have adaptive elements to them. So as an example, an acquisition or a company merger. So in that case, putting together two financial systems or an ERP system, those are technical challenges. There's great people who know how to do that and do that well. But where it becomes an adaptive challenge is dealing specifically with how do you bring the cultures together
Mm.
of organizations. Culture is a great example of where adaptive challenges is, because what do you want to hold on to? What do you want to let go of? So that would be kind of one end of an example. But there's also, I'll give you kind of a personal example. Um, so my mom is 81 years old. And over the last year, she's gotten a couple of fender benders, extra accidents. You look at her car, she's got dings everywhere, where she kind of backed out and kind of hit, maybe a post or something like that. And it's likely it's time for her to turn in her keys. So, it might be thinking, all right, so if she does that, maybe she'll use Uber, maybe we'll have her groceries delivered. She has some other friends who drive, and that may seem like a technical challenge, but the adaptive element is here's someone who has identified, this is their identity of being to have autonomy, to be able to navigate and go where she wants, when she wants, without any freedom. And so, a big part of adaptive leadership is recognizing that, and this is why it's really good in helping organizations or just people go through change, is you recognize that you're asking someone at some level to give something up that they value. So that's the element where adaptive leadership really works well in
So
being able
yeah, so
to.
there's a segment of change management in there as well, I imagine, because you're really talking about it from the human side of it. Like you use the example of a merger where you bring these two cultures together, and I had an opportunity where I brought three cultures onto one site. So we shut down actually shut down two plants. We put it into one larger plant. I was the general manager, and we were bringing these three really unique cultures and three groups of people together on one. And I remember we had one group that was really good at safety. We had one group that was really good in customer intimacy, and we had one
Mm.
group that was really good at being efficient. And so I kind of wanted to get the best of all three worlds. But it turned out to be one of the hardest things I've ever done in my career, because we were facing like the whole project plan to bring the plants together was straightforward. We had a plan. These are things that have been done before, but bringing these cultures together was much more time consuming, required much more effort, and there were many unknowns. So I guess that's an example of what you're talking about, is when you're really
Yeah.
dealing with these a lot of unknowns that you can't really plan for. You can't really. There's not a lot of experts in it, I guess.
Right. And it's also you may have people who, we do a lot of culture work at Evolution, but the reality is it's not a rinse repeat because you're dealing with the human element and dealing with change, and people are being asked to give up something they value. And it could be your examples of those three different cultures. You're asking one group to give up this culture or element that they're in lieu of maybe there's a combined culture,
Mm.
something. And I think giving people that nudge or incentivizing them or attracting them to make that change and letting go of some of the things in the past for the benefit of the future is really hard, and it's risky, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I look back at my leadership career, and it's one of the hardest things I ever did. And it was the one thing that I didn't think was going to be as hard as physically moving all this equipment and setting up the production lines and all that. That turned out to be the easy part. The people side was much more difficult, much more challenging.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned, you described what adaptive leadership looks like. How is it different from maybe some other common leadership styles that we sort of, we know when we've read about, we talk about? How is it
Yeah.
different?
Yeah, so I think the kind of building on what we were saying about the change element. So
Mm,
it is a form of practicing leadership like situational leadership or servant leadership. However, it really works well and is targeted towards leading people through change.
mm,
And and as I was kind of mentioning it, it requires an important understanding that you're asking someone to let go of something they value. It could be a skill set, a mindset, and you're asking people to consider an alternative truth that they may hold, which again is tough. In adaptive leadership, one of the things that we talk about is it almost is like becomes a skill set or a behavior that adaptive leaders embrace. Is It's about recognizing that you are, as the leader, you're managing loss across your organization to some level, and you have to do it in such a way that you distribute loss um, in a way that the organization can handle it, right? You can't just throw it all like, hey, you're letting go of all these things, period, done, let's move on. That works great on a project plan, but in the reality, it becomes a lot more challenging and takes time to really understand what is that thing that you're asking someone to let go of.
yeah, and and everything I've read about change management, change leadership is that that change is difficult. Everyone has a challenge going through change, even if it's change for the better. We're putting in a faster ERP system, and they're like, "Well, but I knew the old one, right?" So so you're always giving up something, and there's always a
Mhm.
loss. One of the things I read somewhere where it talked about, is one of the most important things to communicate when you're going through a change like this is to tell employees what isn't going to change. In other words, give them something that they can hold on to, as the rest of their world might be, a bit chaotic as they're going through a shift and a change. And I thought that was a really good piece of advice, in terms of like give them something to hold on to through this, interim period before, when you let go of the old and you really haven't, the new hasn't been fully implemented yet.
Yeah, that's 100%. And I'm glad you brought that up because, if you just think about in your life, whether it's in business or personal, and we've all felt dysregulated at different times, um, is we tend to, when we're feeling discomfort in some kind of change, we tend to counterbalance and look for something that can be stable. And so I think that's what you're saying, which is a really important part, is acknowledging what is going to be held on to and what is something that they could still rely on that will be consistent for them as they embark on this change journey.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it does. And again, it's the human element, and we've talked about this a lot on this show. Is that humans are messy and they're unpredictable, and they all react to change and stress in different ways. And so you have to be able to deal with that when you're making these big shifts that affect people in this way. So I think it makes a lot of sense. What kind of skills are needed to be an adaptive leader?
Yeah. So there's a few thoughts I have in terms of what skills mapping looks
Hmm.
like. The first thing is I think about being able to manage yourself. I think that's a general leadership skill, but I think it's really important here because you're going to be dealing with people who may not have the capacities to self-regulate and management. So you as the leader have to be that consistent area. And a big part of adaptive leadership is recognizing that this is not something that you're just going to solve and sit in a war room and solve in like a day or an hour or whatever. In fact, one of the recommendations on approaching this is specifically resisting, as a leader, resisting that urge to act.
Hmm.
We're all taught that sense of urgency, bias for action. This is about developing the muscle of not jumping into action too soon until you really understand the problem. So I'd say that that's one good skill. Another one has to do with your ability to listen at a deep level. Not only what's said, but what's not being said. Stay curious, be able to engage in dialogue, ask powerful questions. uh, Another skill that I think is a really important part of adaptive leadership, but also transcends to other parts, is we know from all the research that groups that come together in search of solving a challenge, they when they engage in productive conflict, that can be a powerful catalyst to move the group forward, right? So you as a leader have to know, how do I manage the right temperature or the right pressure for the group to engage in a healthy diet and healthy conflict? Because if you do too much, then the thing explodes. But if you don't do enough, then you run into all these biases that come in, groupthink, and kind of the things where it just doesn't move the needle forward. Uh, the last skill that I think is really powerful is this sense of agility by moving up and down, being able to dive deep, but also to hop up onto the balcony and need to be able to regulate and the agility to move back and forth. So I'd say that those are the four that come to mind.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think, the one thing that, really, what you said really hit me was the impact of our presence on as a leader in a conversation. Like you said, if you've got teams that are doing productive conflict and they're working out a problem, that's and they're a well-run team. They're in conflict, trying to find the best answer, and you jump in there with a solution. You've kind of messed up that whole that whole dynamic. And we can affect you know conversations. We can affect how people relate to each other just when we show up in the room. So that leadership skill of knowing when to step in and when to step away is a really important skill. And it's really hard. To people will say, well, micromanagement is bad, but absent management is bad too. So you always have to find that perfect spot
Yeah,
as a leader. And you have to know, and it's hard. It's a hard thing to define when to step in and when to step out. But you're
yeah.
right, and I love the idea of agility, the ability to dive deep and then take that balcony view, which I
Mhm.
really like, because we have to do that. Especially, I run a small business. I run my own business, and there are times when I'm in the weeds. I have to be, because I don't have very large teams, so sometimes I got to be in the weeds. But then I've got to get out of those weeds sometimes and look at the big picture. What's happening with my competitors? What's happening with the products? Where's pricing at? Where's the margins? Just looking at the whole thing. And so that's a really important skill set. I never really heard of it expressed that way, but the idea of having agility, I can see would
Yeah.
be really powerful in this adaptive environment.
Right, right. Because you're and you may not always know exactly when. So it's almost like if you're present, if you're present and you're focused on the group, it's almost like picking up on an intuition of like, am I operating at the right level? Do I need to pop up or do I need to drill down? And it's not a formulaic element. A lot of it is being present as a leader and picking up on the cues of like, where do I need to be? What's going to serve this group at this right moment?
Yeah, I love what you said about the ability to listen as to what's being said and what's not being said. That is a really key skill. When you're like, nobody's talking here, like maybe I need to get the ball rolling here, or everybody's talking, maybe I need to shut up. And so like, they say just knowing when to interject your leadership presence, I think is probably a really important skill to have in these kind of situations, for
Yeah,
sure.
agreed.
So when do you know if is it obvious when an adaptive leadership approach is needed, or there are certain types of problems or challenges that clearly say you got to take a more adaptive approach?
Yeah. So I think the framework of understanding technical challenges versus adaptive challenges, I think is a really it's a good model to understand. It's like, hey, has this really been done before? Is there an expert in the organization or outside of the organization that can literally, we know the process, we've learned it, um, let's move forward with it. So understanding, is it an adaptive challenge or is it a technical challenges, or frequently they're both,
Mm.
right? So in which case it's what are the adaptive elements? You could not, don't spend some time on, the merging the finance systems or the ERP systems together, unless there's an adaptive element to that. But in the kind of merger acquisition, the culture is going to be your key element. What I do find sometimes is it's misdiagnosed. So
Mm.
what you think, and I think you shared that in your case, you're like, oh, this is this merger acquisition. Like I know all this stuff, but the part that I didn't recognize is the human cultural element. And that's common, is it gets misdiagnosed, which is the reason why in this framework, you want to spend more time than you think you should in really diagnosing the problem to see, is this really a technical challenge? Because if it is, then yeah, don't use adaptive leadership. It's not a good efficiency. But if there is, spend the time to treat it like an adaptive problem.
Yeah, I can see that. And again, with that example I gave you, there was clearly technical challenges, right? And so we had that, and it's funny because we thought that was the big deal, the technical challenges, and oftentimes, it does require a lot of work. You need experts, and most big companies have those experts or can find them to be able to do these kind of things. But that adaptive piece, there wasn't somebody in the company I could call to help. Hey, how do you merge three organizations together and get one culture? And I heard it put one time that culture is a little bit like religion. So how do I get three people with different religions in the same building and operating in the same way? And that's the difficulty of it.
Right. I love your example of religion. I'd never thought about that, so I may steal that.
Oh,
That's
please do, because I
really
stole it from
no,
somebody.
no,
I don't know who.
it's a great way to really talk about adaptive leadership and change, right? Telling someone you have to change your religion.
Yes,
Like that
yeah,
is
that's.
tough, right?
Mm.
So it really equates well. So thank you.
Yeah, no, but that's what you're trying to deal with. That's why these skills you're talking about are so unique and different, because that's the extent, that's the difficulty you're about to approach.
Mhm.
Puts it
Yeah.
it puts it in good perspective, because truthfully, in the example I provided, it was like that. It was we were doing things like, well, that's not the way we did it in our back,
Mhm.
in our plant, or that's not the way we did it in our plant. Or people say, well, these new people are coming to our organization, they have different ways of looking at it, and that's not, we tried that 20 years ago. So you have all these, like, very strongly held beliefs about the right way to do things, and you're trying to, as a leader, blend them, mesh them, show respect for everyone's different opinions, but also say we've got to we got to bring these together into one, and it's really
Hmm.
a big challenge.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned some of the origins of adaptive leadership. Are there places where people can go to find out more about adaptive leadership and learn more about it if they're curious?
Yeah, there's a few books that are really good. And this is actually written by Linsky and Heifetz, the kind of the founders of this. Is Leadership Without Easy Answers is a great book.
Mm,
Leadership on the Line, and then the basic one that I kind of refer is The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. These are three great books. If you want to learn a little bit more about additional resources, there's actually the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School is a good source. And then if you want to learn it for your organization, one of the things we do evolution is we run teams through a simulation. And
mm.
this is a really kind of fun but also thought-provoking simulation. It's called Patient Zero, and it's a fictitious online simulation where you're presented with a zombie apocalypse. And your group, your team is a body of country leaders, and you're faced with all of these really interesting challenges that you have to leverage adaptive leadership to navigate through. And it's part of one of the things we do is we kind of, when we're teaching adaptive leadership or we're doing a program, we could run through the simulation. There's a lot of really good learnings from it. So I'd say
That's
those are some good sources.
no, that's really good. That's helpful. We're going to put links in the show notes for those for people that you can reach out and follow those links and down below here and check out those resources. It's interesting you use the patient zero analogy because we faced this whole COVID crisis as I was I started my business 8 years ago, and who knew that whatever 3 years into it, 4 years into it, I'd face a global pandemic and then a global supply chain crisis, and all these things required me to deal with questions with no answers. Like my employees
Mhm.
would say, well, we didn't know if are we going to be sent home, are we allowed to work, or are we considered a critical resource because we were making products for the electric utilities. I don't
Mm.
know, and so there was a lot of unknowns. There was a lot of human emotion. Do we wear masks? Who gets shots? How do we run the plant? How do we so do we distance each other? So there was a lot of unknown information coming. So being a leader during this was truly an adaptive situation because there was
Absolutely.
there was no there was I always tell people it's my first pandemic. I've never been through one before, so
Great example.
yeah.
Yeah,
Because
that it's
it's a challenge. So if you find yourself in those kind of situations where there isn't a lot of, I would say, known answers, there's no technical experts that can help you, you're probably in that area of adaptive challenge, and it's best to sort of get a handle on what that means, right?
yeah, I think it's a great way of summing it up.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, what final message would you like to leave with our listeners?
So I think just kind of recapping some of the key skills that are really important, and these skills and behaviors that you'll develop through adaptive leadership again are so applicable to how you show up as a leader. Is managing yourself, being able to deeply listen to people, stay curious, ask powerful questions, be able to create and regulate that productive conflict element. And then the last one, which I think you called out, is just the agility to kind of go up on the balcony and then go back down onto the dance floor and really understand those. Those are great skills that you can apply to so many different contexts.
That's fantastic. Yeah, those are great skills for any part of leadership, but especially important when you're in this adaptive environment, as you mentioned. And again, you start with manage yourself, lead yourself first. We talk about that a lot in the show. Listeners, you should be familiar with that term, lead yourself first,
Mhm.
because you got to make sure you have to have things in order so that when the chaos comes, you can handle that, and you're not dealing with a lot of internal chaos yourself. So you can deal with that, and you can be that captain in the storm where you're actually managing things through the storm. So that's a great piece of advice. Really good input. Again, these are things that are good for both adaptive environments and also just regular good old-fashioned leadership. So this has been fantastic. Erik, how can people find out more about you and your company?
Sure. If you go to our site, evolutionteam.team is a good way to do it, and you'll get a little bit of a sense of who we are as an organization. I'm listed on there, so you can learn a bit about my background and kind of the work that I'm passionate about. So that's probably the best way to do it.
Fantastic. When should they call you? When should an organization say, "Oh, you know what? We better give Erik a call."
uh, I think when they're aware that they're running into a challenge, that maybe they're looking for someone who has a different perspective, or even in coaching, I love to work with leaders who are stretched in uncomfortable ways. That's one of my favorite times to come in and support a leader. Maybe they're coming into a scope or a level of impact that they haven't had experience with, and that's usually a good time.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to put links in the show notes for Erik's company, Evolution. And again, if there's something that really resonates with you with this message that Erik has shared, please reach out to him. He's the expert. That's why we bring him on the show. So you have an expert. Now somebody who is an expert in adaptive leadership. So reach out to Erik if you've got a question, or if you've got a team that needs help. You're in an unknown situation. It's clearly an adaptive environment. You need some help, some training, some simulations. Patient zero, is it said
Patient zero,
patient?
yep.
Yeah, patient zero
Super fun.
simulation.
Everyone
uh,
loves it.
yeah. Well, reach out to Erik and you're going to get that resource to help you get through the situation you're facing. So highly encourage you to follow the links that are in the show notes below. Erik, I want to thank you for coming on the show, sharing the knowledge about this important topic.
Great. Thanks, John. Be
Thank you,
well.
Erik. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.